tell some tales of my Theosophic heroes. And I do mean Theosophic and I do mean heroes, because both our founders were the mainstays, and they were the vital physical force in what was said to be a forlorn hope. And the real thing starts in 1851, when Madame Blavatsky, though she wasn't Madame Blavatsky then, came to London with her father. And I'm dying of heat up here. Can I take my jacket off? It's amazing. Oh, we'll put it over there. She came to the Great Exhibition in 1851 with her father. They were watching a procession, well, not a procession, but they were watching some Indian princes who had come for the exhibition, riding past, I believe, on their way to Buckingham Palace. And one of them was particularly tall, particularly striking. And HPB realized that she had contact with him and had seen him many, many times in the dream world. And she made some sort of movement towards him, and he sort of shook his head and stopped her. But the next day, when she was walking in Hyde Park, he met her, and he told her what the hierarchy had in mind for bringing a change in the spiritual life of the Western world. And he pointed out all the problems that she was going to meet, all the difficulties, and asked if she was still prepared to take it on. And of course, she said yes. He didn't say anything about her co-founder yet to be, but from then on, she seemed to receive various, not very well specified pieces of training towards this great job. And so it goes on to 1874, when she went to a farmhouse at Chittenden in Vermont. This sudden uprush of interest in spiritualistic matters in America, and it was of course on one side a very good thing, and on the other side it brought in a lot of charlatans and whatever. And she went to see just how terrifically true these emanations were, because they actually seemed to be able to bring what you might call spooks into their audiences and so forth. And there she met this American Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, who was doing the same sort of job for one of the New York newspapers. And he thought she was pretty weird, and indeed she was, because she had sort of curly, crisp hair, she was wearing a bright red shirt, and she was smoking a cigarette, which nobody did in those days, at least not ladies, though it was quite common in Russia. Ladies always smoked. Not the peasants, strangely enough, but only the sort of upper classes. And he offered her a light for her cigarette, and within a week they were she was his chum. That was his old word for her for the rest of their lives. And so they met, you see. And as I said, if you're the leaders of what is considered to be a forlorn hope, in other words, bringing all the teachings which first of all came out in Isis Unveiled, and then in the greater work which was The Secret Doctrine, and all the problems which they met, they were heroic to stand it all, because there is an enormous amount of pressure. And throughout history, if you study the history of religion, the founders always seem to meet an almost equal power in the opposite direction against which they have to fight. Good evening. Now, what I'm going to talk about is some of the amusing bits, the amazing bits, and the crazy bits that happened to these two, because really some of the things were unbelievably crazy. They seem to draw it towards them. But I wanted to make a couple of points first. I can only this evening deal with the first few years. You see, my script comes out of 5 volumes, and altogether comes to 2,409 pages of closely printed material, because the Colonel, he didn't start his diary until about 1878, which is 3 years after the Society was founded. And for the earlier bits, he sort of wrote it from memory, but since he was deeply involved in everything that happened, it's pretty authentic, and in any case it's not written from that point of view. Another point I'd like to draw your attention to, which is not really often realized, that Madame Blavatsky was concerned with the Society for only 17 years. It all started in 1874, the Society being founded in 1875, and she died in 1891, in which time she'd done an unbelievable amount of work. Most of it as an out-of-the-body experience. To use her own words, she was a writing machine. She didn't write any of it. And when she did, you can, in the Secret Doctrine sometimes, you can pick out where she sort of came in, and the sage who was using her went out, so to speak. And the other thing is, Colonel Olcott was concerned with the Society from 1874 until 1907, which is 33 years. So that we have a diary which runs for about 33 years, ending, of course, with his death. Now, I know that I've told some of these stories before, but I must sort of begin at the beginning, that is the beginning of the Society, to make sense for those of you who haven't heard the earlier sort of stories. He opens his diary by saying there is nothing extenuate, which is a very Victorian way of saying nothing has been lessened, nor set down in malice. And I can assure you that this is true. In the whole of his diary leaves, he is never malicious about anything or anybody. He gets irritated. He got wildly irritated with HPB, who at times could be utterly infuriating. She was Russian, and you know, the Russians are a volatile people, and boy was she volatile if the mood was on her. And then of course she could be very sweet and very gentle, which was what she was in fact most of the time. And the people who knew her well really loved her deeply, and so did Colonel Olcott, because there's a very pathetic little story of him on his deathbed, and the moment before he dies, I think she comes to him in astral form, and his delight at seeing his old horse, which was his name for his great old friend, is so touching. It's a story told by somebody who was there, and strange enough, I knew somebody in their family, but I was too young to have met the person. And perhaps one of the things I regret most, that I was not born early enough to see these two great people, because well, to be honest, they've had an enormous influence on me, and I'm sure when you have heard some of these tales, you will see how remarkable they were. Well, once they'd met in Vermont, the Colonel and HPB, they seemed to know that they had to work together, and they went straight to New York, and he moved into the upper story of her apartment house near Greenwich Village in New York. It isn't there anymore. Arda and I have been taken to see the place during the 100-year celebrations, but it's now seems to be an ice house. I don't know what happened to the apartment house, but there they live on separate floors, and the first floor at HPB's apartments they kept as a sort of office where they did the enormous amount of work that they did. And it was 46 Irving Place. And in 1875, they laid on between them a lecture by a man called George Felt, which was entitled The Lost Canon of Proportion of the Ancient Egyptians, or of the Egyptians. And it apparently seems to have been an absolutely wonderful lecture with beautiful illustrations. Felt was an architect, and this was such a fantastic lecture that everybody said, look, you've got to do some more research into this and publish it, because it is so remarkable. But the funny thing is that there's not a word about what the lecturer actually said, because nothing was recorded. It wasn't a society then, it was just a collection of friends. But after the meeting, when they were sitting round chatting, but hadn't broken up, Colonel Alcott scribbled on a piece of paper, would it not be a good idea to form a society to study this sort of thing? And he gave it to Mr. Judge, who was to become the senior figure of the society in America later on, who handed it to HPB, who looked at it and nodded, and that was the beginning of the society, and that was all that there was to it, except at the end of the meeting. The Colonel was proposed as president, and Mr. Judge was proposed as the secretary, and of course HPB wasn't at that stage anything at all. It went on for a couple of months, slowly sort of growing together, and on November the 18th it was actually founded as a society with the Colonel as the president, founder, Madame Blavatsky as corresponding secretary, and she was never anything else. She never was president. It was the Colonel for the whole of his lifetime. Mr. Judge, it gets a bit obscure. He's either the counsel, he was a lawyer, and so was the Colonel actually, amongst other things. It gets a bit obscure, but I think Mr. Judge was first of all a counsel to the society, and then he moved sideways and became the head of the TS in America. So, in 1875, at an unspecified date, the writing of the first theosophical major work began, that's Isis Unveiled. Now, I've forgotten to do something I wanted to do. At summer school this year, they were selling a new photograph of Colonel Alcott, and I bought a copy because that is the only picture that we have of him here, which is a very beautiful one, but we have a large one at HPB, so I thought we'd have a slightly larger one of the Colonel as well. And perhaps the committee will, if we can't find a frame for it, perhaps the committee can find some money to have it framed, because it's a very nice one. he always looked like that right up until his death, so he describes himself as a pot-bellied old colonel with glasses and a huge white beard, and it is true, that's what he was like. And sometimes when you hear the stories of his life in India and giving 5 lectures a day and wandering about in a bullock cart because there was no transport, you wonder A, why he lost no weight, and B, how he survived it, but he did. And you'll hear some of the things that he was called upon to do. He must have had a marvellous mind. He started off as a lawyer, and then he fought in the American Civil War, and he really fought. He was an infantryman, but he was invalided out because he got a dreadful dose of dysentery, which was not, these days you get a few antibiotics and it dies away, but in those days, if you were not lucky, you got weaker and weaker, and you popped off, so to speak. Well, he didn't do that, but he was not strong enough for the front line anymore. And he moved into what was known as the Judge Advocate's Department, doing his work as a lawyer. And he got his colonelcy because he conducted the trials into corruption. Unbelievable things went on in that war. The merchants in the north sold ammunition to the army in the south so they could kill the soldiers of the north. And other things even, equally as bad. And he sorted all this out, and at the risk of his life, because they threatened to assassinate him if he went on with it, and he did. And he was so successful that the Navy borrowed him then. So you can see that he must have been a very shrewd chap. Another strange thing he did for a period was to run an agricultural college. But he was so far ahead of his day in his agricultural methods that it didn't go very well. They wouldn't believe it would work. And he wrote a book on how to grow bigger crops of sorghum, which I understand is a sort of sugar cane, which was a great success, and I often wonder whether any copy of that still remains. But, he did that on the side. However, they have come to New York and they've started the Theosophical Society. And they're living at 46 Irving Place, and HPB has started writing. Now, he came down one morning and she said to him, I started to write something last night and I don't know what the deuce it's going to be, but it was nothing to do with me, and she was simply acting as a sort of writing machine, but it grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And it began to go at such a speed and such an enormous amount of material that they would work from 2 o'clock from 8 a.m. in the morning till 2 o'clock the following morning. And HPB took no exercise whatever. She couldn't. This work was so sort of being pressed on her in a way, and she grew grotesquely fat. There's no other answer. She went up to 17 stone 7 pounds. And the colonel sort of said, old horse, this simply won't do, because you're not going to live long like this. And he says that, and I'm quoting from the diary, thereafter, after each meal, or perhaps 10 minutes after the meal, she took a glass of water, held her hand palm down over it for a while, looked at it mesmerically, and I'm not quite sure quite how, but there you are, and then she drank it off. And she came down from 17 stone 7 to 11 stone 2 within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. and still took no exercise, but she kept it down by this process, which I suppose is the rearrangement of some molecules and whatever, but it worked very well. And it's a sort of a physical detail which I thought was quite fascinating. Now, the thing is that these enormously long days of work were not really her. He records time and time again in old diary leaves of seeing somebody else looking out of her eyes, and I'll tell you one of the little stories. HPB was out of her body, and the Colonel always knew because she looked different. And sometimes there was a female looking out of her eyes, and sometimes there was a male. Often it was a male, a sort of sadhu, and in those periods she was quite different from herself. Very still, very dignified, very silent, whatever. Scribbling at a very high rate. And one afternoon a lady visitor came, whom they knew, who rushed up to HPB and gushed all over her for 3/4 of an hour, and then patted her hand, kissed her on the cheek, I standing by and seeing the blank despair in the male somebody's face. I conducted the lady to the door, returned to the ascetic someone, a sexless sadhu, if ever there was one, and he turned his mournful eyes on me and in an accent of indescribable melancholy, said, she kissed me. It was too much. I had to sit down. And this sort of thing happened quite often, because on another occasion he rushed in and said, listen, old horse, I must tell you about this. And the face that the face when the being raised its head from its manuscript was of such shocked horror that the poor old colonel had to apologize for about the 540th time, because there is no doubt about it that HPB didn't really write Isis. In fact, she said herself she's nothing but a writing machine. Well, of course, a life like this, sort of 12, 16-hour day, they had to have some time off. And of course, HPB, like Russian ladies of the time, smoked like a chimney, and so did the colonel, and they used to sort of open the window and get some fresh air from New York streets, which I understand were pretty rough even in those days. And HPB would get the colonel to, they had what they called playtimes in the early hours of the morning, and she'd tell tales of magic, mystery and adventure, and get me to whistle or sing comic songs and tell droll stories. And this became a sort of mock fantasy fiction tale of the Moroni family and their descents into matter, their returns to cosmic force, into marriage, changes of creed, changes of skin, and all this in an Irish brogue. And it was an ongoing saga. And the Maloneys was said to be related to the molecules, which I think is really rather funny. And the fun and games between the Maloneys and the molecules must have been heard to be believed, because it was all pure fantasy. And at last, HPB started calling Colonel Alcott Maloney, so he retaliated by calling her Mulligan. And they used to write to one another as Maloney and Mulligan. It's a sort of childish in its way, and yet it was the sort of relief from this incredible amount of work which they did year after year. On the other hand, you know, HPB was a magnificent artist. She painted and she drew and she wrote. And she used to write a lot of articles for the Russian press, which brought her in some money because she didn't seem to have very much of her own. And it is recorded that when she was in London with her father in 1851, she played at a concert, a charity concert, with Clara Schumann, who was Schumann's daughter, I think. Wife. Sorry about that. I wasn't there. With Clara Schumann and Arabella Goddard, who I've not heard of. They played a work of Schumann's for 3 pianos. And actually before coming to America at all, that's before 1874, she had made concert tours in Italy and Russia as Madame Laura. And it's recorded elsewhere that when her friends could get her to play the piano for them, it really was magnificent stuff. And if you look at her portrait at the bottom and look at her hands, it's only her right hand that's really showing, but she really has the most beautiful fingers. Well now, in yes, there's so much material you've no idea. The society was founded in 1875 and it went on through 1876, 77 and 78. And it somehow sank to an all-time low in 1878 where only the New York branch was left. In other words, the curve went up a little way and then went down to one branch. But there it stuck from, there were 2 branches eventually, New York and London. But from 1879 to 1994, it suddenly took off again, and by 94 there were 394 branches. Now in 1878 the TS in England was finally really formed as a whole section, and it is said in the diary that on orders, that means from the hierarchy, the founders left the United States on the 17th of December. En route for England, they went to Liverpool, and they were really en route for Bombay. They'd received orders to open up in India, and they went first of all to London. That was a performance. It was a ghastly ship, apparently, and they seem always to pick ghastly ships. I think it's really because they didn't have all that much money, to be honest. They took passage to Liverpool on the 20th, and on the 31st of December, that can't be right. By the 31st of December, they'd got into the English Channel. And the problem was that, he says, they took on the pilot a deal and he was near blind. It sounds crazy, but and the Colonel says he was so old, he was very old, moss-grown sort of man, and he couldn't tell red from green, and they lost the tide. And they lost the tide, and they were stuck out in the estuary in real British drizzling rain. Absolutely ghastly experience. And on the way over, a table had tipped over and quite badly injured HPB's leg, which was giving her some trouble. But honestly, the very old moss-grown man is really a wonderful description, I think. And they had to stay out in the estuary, by which time the food was running out as well. But at last they got in, and they set off on the 17th of January 79 for Liverpool to catch the steamship Speke Hall, and they set off in a downpour. And when they arrived in Liverpool, it was a downpour. And when they boarded the vessel, which was dirty and disreputable, to see it was still raining. It was a wretched omen for our long voyage to India. They sailed on the 19th of January, 1879, and the poor Colonel had almost nothing to eat. HPB was in the cabin and the saloon after the ship, and the poor old Colonel was forward of the mast, and the weather was so vile that they couldn't get from the forward in the ship to the saloon for meals. And apparently he lived on bread and cheese for 10 days till they got out of the bad weather. And of course by this time HPB was still nursing her hurt knee. The ship was rolling madly, and until they got into the fine weather. They had a terribly miserable time, all of them. They had some friends with them who were going out to help. However, they survived all this, and they really must have been very tough, you know. On the 16th of February they entered Bombay Harbour, and they were met by 3 members of the society, one of whom must have been a tremendous scholar. I don't know if you know this, but there is the first greatest classic Sanskrit dictionary was written by an Englishman called Monier Williams, and one of the members who met them at Bombay was the man who had coached Professor Monier Williams in Sanskrit. You also may be interested to know that in the library, sorry about that, you may be interested to know that in the library we have a copy of Professor Monier Williams' Sanskrit dictionary. The only thing is that unless you know Sanskrit you can't use it because it's all in Sanskrit. It's a pity, but at least you've got to know a great deal of Sanskrit, don't you? Have you looked at it? Well, I did. I have, and it's in Sanskrit. Well, now there were tremendous celebrations going on and HPB when they landed in Bombay, and it was laid down by the Arya Samaj, which was a sort of earlier Theosophical Society in a way. It taught the ancient wisdom, and they laid on a tremendous tamasha sort of party for the Colonel, and then they presented them with a bill for 600 rupees, which they didn't have. But HPB refused to pay, and then discovered that they found the people who laid it on paid the 600 rupees out of the society's funds. And apparently she absolutely hit the roof to such an extent that the 600 rupees were paid back almost immediately, because she must have been something when she was really on the rampage, you know. They met in March. They rented a house in Bombay, which became the sort of headquarters of the TS as it was then. There's one thing about this. The government of India always suspected that HPB in particular was a Russian spy. If you remember your Kipling and the Great Game and Kim and so on, it was the two secret services, British and Russian, were always vying with one another, because all the Russians had to do was to come over the passes through what is now the tip of Afghanistan and so forth. And of course India was full of rich pickings for anybody. And so the Russian and the British Secret Service were always were always, so to speak, fighting each other, and very suspicious of odd beings, and these were two very odd beings arriving in India, particularly as HPB was Russian. And two of our top members in India actually left the TS because of this, because their reputations might be damaged, you know. Instead of telling the government to take a running jump, so to speak, they actually left, but I suppose they felt their jobs were in danger. But the police supervision, according to old diary leaves, was really very funny at times, because the same odd little men would keep on cropping up everywhere, and they got to know them, you know, and used to greet them quite warmly when they appeared, and then they always looked very embarrassed. There's one lovely story of one of these police spies who came to their meeting, and they greeted him, and he blushed very deeply and looked very embarrassed. And when they moved on and the colonel was lecturing somewhere else, he appeared, but he shaved his moustache off. And he was most embarrassed when, despite having shaved his moustache off, they immediately recognized him and greeted him in front of the vast concourse that was there. It was really incredibly childish in some ways, but I read an autobiography, or a biography rather, of Lord Curzon, the then Viceroy, and they really thought that HPB was a spy, you know, and later on they got very suspicious of Annie Besant. Now Annie Besant, of course, was stirring things towards the Quit India days, and they had something to be worried about there, but it really was genuinely taken for granted that she was a spy, and they couldn't make out the colonel at all, because he never took anybody seriously, you see. But there it was. And the colonel ends the stories about them being chased by the police spies by saying, but since the masters appeared, who cares? And of course that's what happened, because the two masters who stood behind the society used to come and visit them right from those early days in America. And then the next great thing, in 1879, they got a letter from A.P. Sinnott, who was the founder, the editor of the great newspaper, The Pioneer, wishing to meet HPB and myself. And his kind offices came at a time most needed. I have never forgotten, nor ever can forget, that we, personally, and the Society, lie under a deep debt of gratitude to him. Because, of course, Sinnott as the editor of the greatest then newspaper in India, did have the respect and confidence of the government, and that meant a great deal in those days. Sinnott was critical of the society, but he remained an ally. And it was one of those curious things where Sinnott, of course, as a Victorian Pakka Sahib in India, could be incredibly clever and far-seeing, and he could be unutterably dim at times. One cannot account for this, but his wife, Patience, was the one of the couple who had the intuition, and she seemed to understand what was taught and what the whole purpose of this great exercise was, without in fact ever being told. Her whole self sort of thing picked it all up. However, it was a great help to the Colonel and a great help to HPB to have Sinnott as an ally, and he invited them to stay with him. He lived in Allahabad, and they went there in December. Now, there is a remarkable story which I'm going to read to you. It's that one, thank you. They were staying in Allahabad. Wait a minute, that's not it. It's the next journal, I think. The talk one evening had embraced the problem of the universal diffusion of intelligence throughout the universe, and an amusing proof of its existence in one of the most stupidest of birds was about that time given us. There was a fowl house behind our kitchen, tenanted by a flock of chickens and one family of ducks, a clumsy Muscovy drake and his 3 wives. Miss Bates of our quartet had the management of the poultry in her hands, and as usual they'd run toward her whenever she came their way. On a certain evening, after finishing our dinner, we lingered chatting at table when a loud crack from beneath Miss B's chair caused us to start up in surprise. It was the waddling, clumsy old drake, which as soon as he saw Miss B noticing him, cracked again, only it's printed in the book as quaked. Cracked again and again, shook his tail, flapped his wings as though something troubled him. He moved, still cracking, toward the door, looking back at her as though asking her to follow him. We saw that his strange behaviour meant something, so we all followed him out of doors, and he led us to the coop where a great row seemed to be going on. Hens screaming, ducks quacking for dear life. Evidently they had been, or were still being, disturbed by rats. Presently, by the light of our lantern, we saw that one of the old drake's wives had thrust her head and neck through the bamboo slats of her coop, and had got caught there by slipping down to a point where the projecting knot of one of the bamboos had so narrowed the slit as to pin her neck fast when she sank. She must have been attacked by some vermin, and flying in her fright against the palings, passed her neck through, but struck her breast heavily against them and fallen. She would have been strangled if her 2 sister wives had not thrust their backs under her, and there they were, supporting her weight, while the drake, escaping through a badly fastened door, came and called for Miss Bates' help. The attention of Messrs. Romanes and Herbert Spencer, you remember the great philosopher, is invited to this proof of animal intelligence, which I thought a delightful story amongst hundreds, in fact,